Last time I was dressed like this, I was dressed for the same reason I am dressed today. I was at a funeral. So one of my good friends, Chris, his father passed away, age 88, life well lived, and so today is going to be in honor of him and Chris's family. And the priest there, this was at an Orthodox church in Pittsburgh area, brought something up today that during this ceremony that I thought was phenomenal, very inspiring and very interesting, and it's something we've talked about here, and I've not heard it mentioned in many Christian churches anywhere. And he mentioned Israel and the meaning of the word Israel. Now, hopefully you guys remember that, at least some aspect of it. But I am obviously not particularly Buddhist because I'm still clinging to this drawing that I did a couple weeks ago, last time you were all here. Still clinging because it's so neat. I've never written so neatly. And for me, that's very good. But I didn't erase it yet. And I realized I can use it one more time. I'm going to use the concept of Israel and what it actually means in combination with this drawing from a couple weeks ago. You guys all remember what this was about? Soul wars. The fact is we're all in different levels of spiritual development. Some people are operating on the kindergarten or the nursery school level, others in maybe college level, but for the most part from grades 1 to 12, it's a very easy way to think of it. Some people are operating as first graders. You can tell they're very ego driven, they're physical focused, they're interested in the physical world, physical power, and they're interested in stuff. And there's a lot of arguing that goes on there. And as we start to climb this, grade school, if you will, we start to become more spiritual. The diversities change and they get more difficult. It's sort of like going through school. You get more difficult math every year, don't you? Becoming spiritual doesn't get easier. It becomes more difficult. And this is perfect for what the word Israel means, right? And so the man that died, John was his name, 88, he was a wrestler in high school. And when he had his son Chris, he also became a wrestler. And the priest talked about how they wrestled with God, which is the meaning of the word Israel in Hebrew. So I'm going to read from you Genesis 32:22, the story of how Israel came to be in wrestling with God. And it's a story of Jacob, the grandson of Abraham, and he had an experience in which he wrestled with God. And this is titled Jacob Wrestles with God. And Jacob was left alone. And a man wrestled with him until breaking of the day. And then he said, "Let me go, for the day has broken." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." And he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." Then he said, "Your name shall no longer be Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed." Then Jacob asked him, "Please tell me your name." But he said, "Why is it you ask my name?" And then he blessed him. So Jacob called the name of the place Pineal. Now that's very important. We're going to get back to that. Pineal. Okay? You might have heard of that before, the pineal gland. Well, this is a story about a man named Jacob who ends up getting called Israel because he wrestled with God that day. And this story is actually about, not actually a physical wrestling match, although that might be relevant. It's very specifically a spiritual wrestling match, which is really this journey of what we're all going through school. I like to think of it as, think of a high school teacher that perhaps was very challenging to you, all right? Or maybe your high school coach that pushed you to be your best. There's a certain wrestling quality there too, right? They push you to be better. You might argue with them sometimes. Your parents are like that sometimes. All relationships are like that sometimes. But all of us have a relationship like that with God. Israel in Hebrew literally means wrestles with God. It has a couple different definitions. Isra means wrestles with or connection to. And obviously if you're wrestling someone, you're connected with them, okay? Now in Kabbalah they teach that the point in your development when you become interested in spiritual development, which will happen to everybody. First graders might not be interested in stuff seventh graders are interested in, but one day they'll get there. People might be interested in the physical world and arguing with each other and trying to get dominion over the physical world, right? But eventually they're going to get to a place where they're interested in spiritual development. At that point, that's called Israel. When you are now interested in your spiritual development. And now you're going to be wrestling with God. What does that look like? All of us are in the physical world, doing physical things, while we've got this spiritual backdrop going on. Once you start to realize it's a spiritual world, you start paying attention to that more. But it's hard, right? The spiritual things we have to do, like dropping the ego, giving up, the idea of the physical obsession, wanting the physical stuff, all our addictions that we have to give that up. We also have to do difficult things like to forgive people, right? And be patient in traffic, right? And merciful and kind and compassionate. And worst of all, loving our enemies. Woo, that's tough work. We're in a physical world where we have physical people who are actually spiritual beings, and they don't want any part of that spiritual stuff. But once you're engaged, just like a good high school teacher or you're a good high school coach that pressures you because they see in you your potential, next thing you know, you got a grappling going on, right? And that teacher or that coach will continue to pressure you again and again and again until because it's in your best interest. So then we get better and better and stronger. Which reminds me of the first page, the introduction of the Course in Miracles. It's a 1,500-page book. I've said many times, it's an incredible book, but just this introduction is enough. Check this out. This is a Course in Miracles. It is a required course. Only the time you take it is voluntary. Free will does not mean that you can establish the curriculum. It only means that you can elect what you want to take at any given time. The curriculum is mandatory. Each one of us has to go through the same curriculum. Just like a first grader becomes a second grader and third grader and probably learns his ABCs, then puts together some sentences, learns 1 + 1 = 2, then the square root of 49, stuff like that. The curriculum is mandatory. All of us are in a physical world that's actually spiritual, and all of us must learn this curriculum. Miracles says it's mandatory. You don't get to decide the curriculum. Well, you get to decide whatever physical stuff you want to do. You can become a teacher or a doctor or a homemaker or, an artist, whatever. You can do that stuff. But the curriculum is a spiritual one. It's mandatory. You will learn it. Which brings to mind Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. The Lord, which Krishna says is the highest self within the self, will restore your soul, okay? You were being forced to lie down in green pastures. You know what green pastures are? You know what the heart chakra is? It's green. And you're being forced to find peace. You're also being forced beside still waters. You know what still waters are? It's a calm mind. Water is a metaphor for thought, and we know what it's like when it's choppy up there. Lots of stress and anxiety. But we are being forced beside still waters. He leads me in the path of righteousness. Well, that's interesting. It's a spiritual world after all. And whatever you want to do physically is fine, but you must learn the virtues. You must. What happens when you learn the virtues? We're going to get back to that in the pineal gland in a second. Even though I walk through the valley of shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Now, again, when you have this awareness and you are wrestling with God, you know that that's your enemy, so to speak. Jesus says, of course, you must love your enemy, which means God is going to be your number one adversary, or so it seems for a while. We might even have a few times where we're pretty mad at God for a bunch of obvious reasons. Life's tough. It's challenging, but the bar is high. Look what he did to his son. Jesus had to go through his own torture and murder, right? Thanks, Dad. That's hard work. It's high-level work. For the spiritual being, it's especially difficult, okay? But he knows what's in your best interest. Dropping that ego, crucifying that ego, rising to the level of your divinity. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. Of course, they're in your face, and always will be. It's like grade school and high school, you're always going to have enemies around you. Lots of people causing issues, creating stress for you, right? But it's a challenge. You got to get through that to graduate. We're dealing with that all the time, especially in today's culture. You anoint my head with oil. That's the Holy Spirit, right? It's not like just getting baptized with water. It is getting baptized with the Holy Spirit. That's what we need to be doing. Surely goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. That's graduation, right? Whenever we master the virtues. In this book, Hope is Dope, which is my addiction and recovery book that talks about science and spirituality a little bit, we have scientifically looked at all various virtues that produce positive brain chemistry. And I'm just going to name some things, again, all scientifically studied, also known as logical, that produce healthy brain chemistry. Hope, compassion, gratitude, courage, forgiveness, patience, integrity, passion, wisdom, and love. Do those sound like good characteristics? Are those virtues? Well, all of them produce positive brain chemistry. Whatever adversity you're facing in your life, these are always available to you. And if you respond to adversities, physical world adversities, like traffic jams with patience, you're going to feel better. You know, green pastures, still waters. If you're faced with someone who hurt you, you must learn forgiveness. You're going to learn forgiveness. That curriculum is mandatory. It doesn't matter where you learn it. You can learn it from someone at work, or from any type of colleague, or someone in your family. You can learn it from a political enemy, but you will learn forgiveness. You're being forced to. The curriculum is mandatory. You can learn it by forgiving Tom Brady from a distance. That works too. Okay? But you're going to learn forgiveness. Wisdom. Buddha's first step of the Eightfold Path is right view. Seeing the world clearly, understanding what this world actually is. That's right view. You'll learn wisdom. Nobody escapes this place or leaves this place or graduates until they pass certain tests, including understanding a few basic things. You're not what you think you are. The ego is the lower self. The spirit is the higher self. Once you know that in full, you graduate. And you'll dwell in the house of the Lord forever. That means knowing you're a spiritual being forever. What else you have to learn? You have to learn integrity. I think that one's pretty obvious. See how often you can get away with lying, right? Eventually you're going to have to learn how to man up. And most people in my existence and my work recognize how good it feels to not have to hide anymore, right? Not have to lie anymore. Courage, facing fears, not having fears, but facing fears. It always feels good, right? And so we are given opportunities to face courage. Maybe it's in war. Maybe it's in a relationship. Maybe it's in a new job. That's all courage, right? You'll learn courage. Nobody likes cowardice. It always feels better. Gratitude. The attitude of gratitude. Very helpful to be grateful for things, not take things for granted. We live in a crazy fortunate country who keeps fighting with each other about stuff because we disagree over how to split all the stuff. And again, most of the people in this country are way ahead of most people in the world in terms of our affluence. Where's the gratitude? Not much of it. And yet it only feels good to be grateful. Of course, we're being forced to be grateful. Complain about things and see how good that feels. Of course it doesn't. Positive brain chemistry. Hope. Who likes feeling hopeless? No one. This book is called Hope is Dope because hope literally produces an opioid-like chemical in the brain called endorphins. Being hopeless is depressing, but being hopeful, for example, like realizing we all have the ability to scale this mountain, and that not just me, you, everybody throughout the world will do this eventually. We're all on the same team. That's quite hopeful. It feels good to think that way too. We're all being forced into unity. And I could go on, okay? This is where the pineal gland, where Jacob becomes Israel and he calls the place that he was wrestling with God the pineal. Well, guess what? We all have a gland inside of our head. It's sometimes called the seat of the soul. I believe Descartes called it that. Goes back, to Aristotle and Socrates and those guys as well. The pineal gland is a spiritual gland. Rick Strassman wrote a book called DMT, the spirit molecule, which they say the pineal gland releases. DMT is a very powerful psychedelic, and it's produced by our own brains. It gives us a very spiritual experience. See, the brain is a finely tuned mechanism that's teaching us all these virtues. We have to learn them by perceiving them in a certain way, by looking at each other in a certain way, by saying namaste and Buddha, 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 and you are the light of the world, and I'm the light of the world, and I forgive you, and all that kind of stuff. We have to do all of that. Anything short of that is like 7th, 8th, 9th grade at best. But we will get to a place where we all see the light in each other. That's gonna happen, okay? And of course that's good news. And so what's the Israel? Israel is wrestling with God. Each one of us has to look at ourselves, especially in relation to those virtues, and say, where do I need to improve? Do I need to work on more patience, more forgiveness, more gratitude? And maybe you've mastered some of that, but how are you at loving your enemies? Or are we still so interested in getting physical world stuff that, as Jesus says, we lose our soul? Right? Each one of us is supposed to be judging ourselves for that. And of course we can judge each other lovingly like our teachers would, or a coach who cares about you would. Maybe we need to bump up that virtue there, okay? And we struggle with that. That's wrestling with God. But when Jacob overcame and he became known as Israel because he was struggling and connected with God, he had access to that pineal gland. He released the chemicals inside of himself. He got to experience some of that Zen-like mindful Bodhi state, okay? Which is available to us all. So since this day started with the funeral, I'd like to end with that concept as well. See, one of the greatest challenges in wrestling with God is the idea of death itself, right? The idea of overcoming that concept. What did Jesus do other than show us that death isn't what we think it is? He literally came to overcome death. We think of death as the end. You know what? God's going to teach us a few more lessons, okay? But if we understand what it is, it's a transition, like a 12th grader graduating and going to college. I mean, that's a little sad if you love your kid and he's going off to college, you know, empty nest and all that. But at the same time, it's a joyous occasion when someone graduates. Right? It's also a joyous occasion when someone passes into the kingdom of heaven. I love the way the priest said it of Chris's father. He had a great Christian ending, right? You live to 88 and you're connected, you've wrestled with God, and the priest said that again and again. What a life. And we don't have to worry about this place called hell. All hell is first grade. You haven't developed much, you know? I mean, I'm not talking about actual first graders, but that's what it feels like in our process. We all grow. Acorns grow into oak trees. We will all grow into spiritual beings. If you like what we're talking about here, please subscribe, comment down below, hit like. Don't hit the dislike button because it doesn't count anymore anyways.